a couple weeks ago, there was a conference in Jerusalem. It was the second annual conference on combating anti-Semitism. It focused heavily, as it should, on the threat of Islam, to Jews worldwide. And one of the speakers at the convention, at the conference, was Saad. Maybe you've heard of him. He is a great public intellectual. He's really a professor up in Canada. And he's of Lebanese origin. He tells his story in the speech that he gave at the conference, but he also talks about a problem that I want to address, the problem of Jews who turn against the Jewish people. So let's go take a look at this speech, and then I've got a little bit to say about it.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Glad to see you all here. So today what I thought I would do is explain how Jew hatred is akin to a latent virus. A latent virus is one that can infect a human being, but then it could lay dormant for many, many years, and there is something that triggers its resurgence. So for example, for many of you who are in your 50s or 60s, you've heard about the shingles virus. The shingles virus lays dormant in you, and then when you're in your middle age, it could flare up and cause some serious complications. And so I'd like to demonstrate how, in my own life, I've experienced the shingles virus of Jew hatred, first beginning in the Middle East, in Lebanon, and continuing in Montreal, Canada. But between those two periods, from the 1970s to more recently, the shingles virus of Jew hatred lay dormant for many, many years, but now it is so flaring up that I long for the warm days of the Lebanese Civil War, given some of the realities that I face in Montreal. So let's begin with my background. I was born in, by the way, usually if I didn't have an injury, I would be walking everywhere. I'm a very animated speaker, so you'll forgive me if I'm a bit more restrained in my movements. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon. We were part of the last generation, last group of Lebanese Jews that had steadfastly refused to leave Lebanon. And this is exactly where the shingles virus is a really apt metaphor, because people say, well, but you had a great life in Lebanon. Well, yes, we had a great life until we had to put on running shoes and run really fast to avoid being executed. That said, though, even though Lebanon was referred to as colloquially as the Paris of the Middle East, it wasn't as tolerant as you would think. So let me give you some examples of the tolerance that we faced in Lebanon. In 1970, when I was 5 years old, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Pan-Arabist president of Egypt, had just passed away. And he was revered in much of the Arab world. And as often happens in the Middle East, when somebody dies, people take to the street and they do all these big lamentations. As they were proceeding down my street, thousands of them, what's the thing that they were singing or screaming? Death to Jews in Arabic. And as a 5-year-old, I was confused. I turned to my mother, why are they singing death to Jews because some guy died in Egypt? She said, just keep quiet, put your head down. So that was my first experience of Jew hatred in tolerant, progressive Lebanon. Fast forward to about 2 years before the Civil War, our teacher asked us to each get up and say what we wish to be when we grow up. I want to be a policeman, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a soccer player. And a kid gets up and says, when I grow up, I want to be a Jew killer, to everybody's applause and laughter. My brother David, who's 10 years older than me, was the Lebanese judo champion for several years in a row. And that brings great shame in Lebanon for a Jewish guy to be constantly winning all these athletic competitions. And so he was approached by some men. This is before the start of the Civil War. He was approached by some men who told him that it was time for him to retire, lest he may face some unfortunate accident. and he ended up leaving Lebanon to pursue his career in Paris, France. This is before the Civil War. Now, in 1976, we had already emigrated to Montreal, Canada, and coincidentally, the Olympics that year happened in Montreal. It was the 1976 Montreal Olympics, and my brother ended up representing Lebanon in the 1976 Montreal Olympics. So the same Jewish guy who in 1973 had to leave Lebanon because he suffered from the dreadful disease of being Jewish, we could forgive the fact that he's Jewish once he represents Lebanon. That's what we mean in progressive Paris of the Middle East. On one of their return trips to Lebanon, my parents in 1980 were kidnapped by Abu Nidal's group, Fatah. And so many of the tragic stories that, of course, we all heard about post-October 7th is what my childhood was like in progressive, tolerant Lebanon. So this is the sort of world that I come from. I'll just mention one quick story and then I'll move to the present Jew hatred that I have faced. As we left the Beirut International Airport to emigrate to Canada, and as the pilot gave an alert that we were now outside of the Lebanese airspace, my mother takes out a Star of David, puts it around my neck, and says, now you could wear this, not hide your identity, and be proud of who you are. Now hold that thought, because 45 plus years later, about 2 weeks after October 7th, my son had just returned from a soccer match in Montreal, in the east end of Montreal, where there's a particular prevalence of a particular demographic group. And as he picked me up with my wife, he said to me, Daddy, if you had come to watch me play soccer where I played today, and if you were wearing a Star of David, you'd be dead. So in 1975, I left Lebanon so that I can finally wear a Star of David. And in 2023, I better take off a Star of David. And yesterday, as a symbolic gesture, we went to the Jerusalem Souk and I bought a Star of David from Jerusalem. Just to give you a sense also of my more ancestral family in terms of Jew hatred, some of my grandparents escaped Syria because of Jew hatred. We escaped Lebanon because of Jew hatred. My brother-in-law's family are Alexandrian Jews. They escaped Egypt in the 50s because of Jew hatred. My wife's family, their ancestors escaped the Armenian genocide. Their family too also left Lebanon. So within my own family's narrative and that of my wife, we've ran away from Turkey, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Egypt. But then we had finally made it to Canada. And for the next 25, 30 years, there'd be little peppering of minor Jew hatred, but it was generally a good place to live. But then in around 1998, late 90s, I started noticing what I colloquially and satirically refer to as freedom veils. Those are the wonderful, noble, emancipatory, sartorial designs that Islamic women wear. And the first woman I saw, I thought, okay, that seems okay. But from 1998 till today, if I walk out of my house, 30, 40, 50% of the women that I'll come across will be veiled. But what's the big deal, Professor Saad? It's just an exotic headscarf. No, there's a meaning to that headscarf. And you don't have to be a fancy professor to predict that demography is destiny and things are going to go bad for Jews once certain other ideologies take over. My home university is at Concordia University, for those of you who may have heard of it. It's the university that canceled Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2002. Before it was cool to be canceled, he was canceled 24 years ago. My university has been referred to as Gaza University for 25 years. So imagine a public figure such as myself who really doesn't mince words in my defense of the Jewish people, my defense of Israel, my antipathy towards many of the canons of Islam, now having to walk on campus to lecture. Well, it was no longer possible. So in the 21st century, a professor, a Jewish professor in Montreal, Canada, has to take a leave. I'm now on a 2-year leave, but it might, inshallah, become a permanent resignation soon. I'm on a leave because it's too dangerous for me to be at Concordia. So that gives you a bit of the type of Jew hatred that unfortunately I've had and my family has had to face. But now what I'd like to do is quickly shift to some of the psychological reasons why Jew hatred is so alluring to the architecture of the human mind. Of course, we could talk about theological-based Jew hatred in Christianity or in Islam. We can talk about the far right having Jew hatred in their heart and so on. But I'd like to talk about other forms of Jew hatred and why they exist, which you may not be familiar with. The first type of Jew hatred that I'm going to talk about is arguably the one that I detest the most, and that's the self-loathing Jew who hates Jews and who takes positions that are perfectly suicidal, hence suicidal empathy. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, or maybe those who are not, you'll learn here, I refer to such Jews as wood cricket Jews. And why do I refer to them as wood cricket Jews? This comes from the field of neuroparasitology. A wood cricket is an insect that detests water. It wants nothing to do with water. But when it is parasitized by a hairworm, it's a brainworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water, happily commit suicide, in order for the hairworm to complete its reproductive cycle. So the hairworm has literally hijacked the brain of this animal to suit its reproductive interest. Well, hashtag Queers for Palestine are the ultimate wood crickets. Gabor Mate, the degenerate imbecile, is the perfect example of a wood cricket. Because Gabor Mate, as I explained in my lecture in Tel Aviv a few days ago, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's an addiction specialist in Canada who basically says that I have been a Holocaust survivor, because that way he's got the credentials, the experiential credentials to prepare you for what he's about to say. By the way, his Holocaust survivor story is that when he was 6 months old, he was given to a Christian family to be protected. Well, 6 months old babies cannot consciously survive anything. They're not cognizant of what's happening to them. But he uses that to then say, I'm Jewish, I went through the Holocaust, and I'm here to tell you that the Nazis are nothing compared to how Nazi-like the Israeli state is. But had Gabor Mate, the wood cricket, been at the Nova Festival, and had he been kidnapped, I think that he would be praying for those Nazi IDF soldiers to come and rescue him. That's what a wood cricket is. And the world that I inhabit, which is the university ecosystem, is laden with wood crickets. Not only Jewish wood crickets, but oftentimes academics tend to be very much on the left, and being on the left is more likely to cause you to become a wood cricket. For those of you who don't know the famous novella by Franz Kafka, who was himself a Jewish author from the Czech Republic, he wrote a great novella called The Metamorphosis, where a guy wakes up one day and he's an insect. And now his family has to interact with him, no longer recognizing that he's a human being, but an insect. Well, I'm here to tell you that 100+ years after Franz Kafka's famous book, academia is filled with nothing but wood crickets. Second point about some of the psychological reasons why Jew hatred will regrettably maybe never go away. Well, there's something in psychology called the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is how we attribute successes and failures in our lives. Most people attribute successes internally, right? I did well in my business because I'm a smart entrepreneur. It's because of my talents that I did well. And we attribute failures externally. I did poorly in my business because customers are too dumb to understand my brilliance, right? And that's a way to protect yourself as you go through life. Well, imagine if you can always find the ultimate external culprit for all of your individual and collective failings, right? And it's the Jew. Why did I not make it as an actor? Well, because it's the Jews that control Hollywood. Why is it that I didn't get a mortgage for my house? Who controls the banks? It's the Jews. By the way, did you know that in 2010, very close to here, in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, there were some shark attacks? Well, the wonderful Egyptian mukhabarat, which like the intelligence services, concluded that those sharks were Zionist sharks. This is not a joke. You can go and find it. 2010 Sharm el-Sheikh attacks, Jew sharks, because the Jew sharks would then damage the tourism industry of Egypt. This is what I call 6 degrees of Jew. For any calamity around the world, I give you up to 6 causal links to explain why it's the Jews' fault. So if a frog in the Amazon dies, you've got 6 steps. How do we blame it on Mordechai? I will end because I'm looking that time is up, although they told me I could go a bit longer. Thomas Sowell, for those of you who don't know who that is he's still alive. He's 95 years old. He's a fantastic economist. He is the model of what professors should be like, but he so hated academia that in the early 80s he said, I'm out of here. He became a fellow at the Hoover Institution. I've been petitioning behind doors for him to get the presidential Freedom Medal from President Trump. Well, Thomas Sowell was once asked, what's it going to take, Professor Sowell, for the Jews to no longer be hated? And he paused and he gave one of the most brilliant one-word answers. He said, fail. In other words, for people to stop hating the Jews, we need to fail. And I'm here to tell you, regrettably, that we shall always be hated because we shall always persevere and we shall always win.
Sorry, there you go. I thought that was a brilliant diagnosis of the issue of especially the part where he talked about wood crickets, Jews who are self-hating Jews. And this has been on my mind a lot since October 7th, especially where we've had a lot of anti-Israel sentiment coming out of the Jewish community, coming out of the progressive part of the Jewish community. You've had a lot of Jewish students. This is the dirty little secret no one wants to talk about, is that some of those tent encampments on college campuses, those pro-Hamas demonstrators, they were led by Jews, by progressive Jews. Progressive Jews are some of the worst enemies of the Jewish people themselves. I don't think there's anyone who consistently votes against their own self-interest as much as progressive left Jews. So, for example, here, take a look at this. In the election in New York City that recently took place, exit poll finds that 1/3 of New York City Jews backed anti-Israel Mamdani. 1/3 of Jews voted for Mamdani, who's openly anti-Israel. He came up through the ranks of politics as an anti-Israel activist. That's how he got his start in political activism, starting a Students for Justice in Palestine branch at his college campus. But even though 1/3 of Jews backed him, look what it says down here. The Jewish neighborhoods, although 1/3 of Jewish voters backed Mamdani, Jewish neighborhoods across the city overwhelmingly favored Cuomo, right? And the Jewish neighborhoods, it then goes on to say that the Jewish neighborhoods in New York were over 90% for Cuomo, not for Mamdani. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the Jews who were voting for Mamdani actually don't even live in the Jewish neighborhoods. That actually makes sense, because the Jews who would vote for Mamdani have disconnected from the Jewish community. They're not part of the Jewish faith. Anyone who adheres to the Jewish faith lives near a synagogue, lives in the Jewish community. Jews live in their own communities together. They have their own schools, right? So it shouldn't be surprising that the Jews who voted for Mamdani also weren't part of the numbers. There was these over 90% numbers that voted for Cuomo. Not that he's a great guy, but he was the alternative to Mamdani in the Jewish neighborhoods. Okay, so this is just I wanted you to see the speech from God Saad, and it's just another reminder that at this point in Jewish history, where the Jewish nation is in our land and the Jewish nation has been restored, Jews who oppose the well-being of the Jewish people are kind of writing themselves out of Jewish history. That's how I see it. We'll talk about this topic more in some upcoming videos. Please drop me a comment. Let me know what you think about these videos. Let me know what you think about what God Saad had to say. And please make sure to check out all the great content that we're putting up at the Israel 365 News YouTube channel, and keep watching. God bless.